And we can start. Brilliant. So, hello everyone, and welcome to this Research and Knowledge Exchange event organized by the University of Roehampton for the successful completion of the Erasmus project promoting effective communication for individuals with vision impairment and multiple disabilities. My name is Lida and I'm your event host. I'm also one of the presenters, so I'm going to say a little bit more about my role and my research later on. For now, let me tell you that we have a very exciting lineup of presenters, and I really hope you enjoy this event that we've put together. Just to say also that during each of the talks, you can type any questions you may have in the Q&A box, and we shall address as many as possible afterwards. And now, to formally kick off the event, Dr. Richard Keogh, Vice Provost for Research and External Engagement at the University of Roehampton, has kindly agreed to say a few words. Richard, over to you.
Thank you very much, Lida, and thank you very much also for asking me to come along today to offer some opening remarks and welcome everyone to today's event. As many of you will know, we are incredibly proud of our rich history in education practice and research at the University of Roehampton, which now stretches back nearly 180 years. And I was very interested to see that this was referred to as both a research and knowledge exchange event. And I think what many of the early pioneers at Whitelands College, then Digby Stewart, then Southlands and Froebel colleges at the university would have been considered in that framework of knowledge exchange. And I think it really speaks to who we continue to be as a university in terms of the ways in which we want to engage the world around us, inform practice, and crucially a commitment to social justice and the moral authority that imbues research organisations and higher education institutions with. We're also incredibly proud of the research into special educational needs at university and the profound impact that it's had internationally. And it's in that context that we're very proud to continue to invest in this work. And we are also delighted to welcome you all here today. It's been a very long year for all of us, and it still feels like there's a little bit of a way to go. And as a result, I'd just like you to indulge me for a few minutes in relation to the rest of this opening remark, where I'm going to offer some broader reflections around the importance of events like this, specifically in the context of, firstly, the pandemic that we've all experienced this year, and secondly, the Brexit debates and the potential of a no-deal Brexit that we're looking at the moment. And I think that it's incredibly important to use the opportunity of this event to reflect on those two things, because it illustrates the very best of researchers and the way in which they've responded to these challenges this year. We're immensely proud of Lida and other colleagues that have organised this event for a number of reasons. I think first, the transnational nature of it, both in terms of participants and speakers, speaks to the importance of international collaboration, which I'm very happy to say that we are committed to and continue to invest in, and the ways in which it enriches the research endeavour more broadly. I think it also crucially spans sectors and professions and brings them into dialogue, ensuring the benefits of research, but also being led by practice, are to the benefit of all. And finally, I'd like to commend the inclusion of colleagues at all career stages as speakers and participants here today, and celebrate the inclusive practices that highlights and brings to the fore. So I'll stop there and just finally congratulate and thank Lida for assembling such an esteemed and interesting group of colleagues today. And I'm sure it will be a very thought-provoking and insightful afternoon. I hope you'd all enjoy it.
Thank you very much, Richard. And now, the first speaker, I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Kanari, from the Department of Special Education at the University of Thessaly, who was part of the team that very competently led the PrECIVIM project on behalf of the University of Thessaly. Dr. Kanari will provide an overview of Erasmus PrECIVIM, and she's going to give us an overview of what has been achieved in those 3 years. Hara.
Is it okay with my, you can see the presentation?
Yes.
Thank you. So I'm Hara Kanari. I want to thank Dr. Lida Kamenopoulos for this invitation and to participate in this conference. From the University of Thessaly and from the Department of Special Education. I'm going to present the PrECIVIM project, the roadmap, the activities, and the intellectual output of the PrECIVIM project. The full title of the PrECIVIM project is Promoting Effective Communication for Individuals with Vision Impairment and Multiple Disabilities. It is a project approved by the Erasmus program under the Key Action 2, which supports strategic partnerships and in the field of education, and also the cooperation for innovation and the exchange of good practices. The project coordinator is Dr. Vasilios Argyropoulos from the Department of Special Education from University of Thessaly in Greece. A few words for the theoretical framework of the PrECIVIM project. The theoretical framework of PrECIVIM projects includes issues regarding the communication, the role of communication in people's life, and how people's behavior always express messages, verbally, non-verbally, intentionally or not intentionally, and with many different ways. It also includes issues regarding the complexity of the communication and the importance of effective communication, finally, in our life. Regarding children with MDVI, we all know that the heterogeneity of these children is enormous, and they face a lot of difficulties in their interaction in their environment due to the combination of the various disabilities, and of course, based on the individual characteristics of each child. So communication is a fundamental domain of communication, of education of children with MDVI, since it affects learning and participation in different sectors of life. And this is a challenge for teachers and professionals who work with children with MDVI. Each child with MDVI presents a unique educational talents, and all children present some level of communication using specific behaviors to communicate a message, or they have developed some skills, but often there is a risk of their communication not to be recognized as such. So a range of skills, receptive, expressive, sensory, and motor skills have to be developed, and for this reason, assessment is an important factor in order to help teachers and professionals to set realistic goals, develop appropriate learning exercises, and address the educational needs of children with MDVI. So the main PrECIVIM project focuses on teachers and professional training needs regarding the assessment and instruction of communication skills. And the main aim of the PrECIVIM project is to link the act of assessment with the act of intervention. And the objectives are to enhance professional skills and knowledge regarding the development of communication skills of children with MDVI, to promote collaboration between different organizations, to point out best practices and guidelines, and finally create communicative learning and social opportunities for children with MDVI. In order to achieve the aforementioned aims, 10 organizations participate in this project, creating networks within each country and between different countries. The countries are Greece, Romania, UK, and Cyprus. More specifically, we have partners are universities, University of Thessaly, which is the coordinator of the project, Babas Polia University from Romania, and Roehampton University from UK. Our partners are also schools, special schools for the blind, for deaf blind from Greece, the special high school for visually impaired from Romania, Whitefield Academic Trust from UK, and St. Barnabas Schools for the Blind from Cyprus. We also collaborated, we have collaborated with non-governmental organizations as Amimoni, which is a Pan-Hellenic associations of parents and friends of visually impaired people with additional handicaps, and European Blind Union as an associated partner. And also our partner was an IT company. So a short picture of the roadmap of the PrECIVIM project we can see in this slide. The first intellectual output was scoping. The second was the learning, the project learning and communication platform. The third one was the training material. The fourth were the mutual learning experiences and blended learning. And the development of a guide of best practices, a range of dissemination and exploitation activities during the lifetime of the project. And this event is also a part of this intellectual output, the development of a policy recommendation and guidelines report, miscellaneous videos, and finally, we're moving to the end of the project. So let me say a few words for each intellectual output. For each intellectual output, there is a leading organization, but all partners contribute to the development of each intellectual output. So the first one was scoping and situation analysis, and the leading organization was Roehampton University. The aim of this intellectual output was to determine the needs and the challenges that professional needs in order to develop communication skills of children with MDVI. And it was based on lit review on policies, practices, and relevant research within the participating countries, and also to on data from participating schools and educational settings, in total 6 case studies. They were very interesting results. Such as for example, that a range of practices and programs that were used in these educational settings that also revealed the need for systematization and dissemination of these practices and programs, for more teachers training programs, and the need for more empirical research. I have to say that the final report is in 3 languages, in English, in Romanian, and in Greek. The second one, the second intellectual output was the platform, which acts in different ways as a source of information and communication between the partners, a platform for online training events, for the dissemination of public information about the project, and also it will act for the access of the intellectual output of the project to stakeholders outside of the project as an open educational resource. The third intellectual output was the development of a training material. The leading organization was Babes-Bolyai University from Romania. The training material was developed into the format of a syllabus with 3 main modules. For the first one was about the conceptual framework of the development and characteristics of people with MDVI, the development of communication skills for people with MDVI, and issues of assessment and communication. I have to say that the training material was the basis for the learning training events, and it will be available after the end of the project to stakeholders outside of the project in 3 languages, in English, in Romanian, and also in Greek. The heart of the project was where the mutual learning experiences and the critical overview. A framework of blended training was adopted during the PrECIVIM project. The leading organization here was the University of Thessaly. Face-to-face training events took place during the lifetime of the project, and in total 147 professionals from all educational settings have participated in these training events. And also we had synchronous and asynchronous online training events. 119 professionals have participated in these synchronous and asynchronous online events. A few words for the characteristics of the face-to-face training events, where as we say, training on the go. Academics from different universities worked with professionals from different countries. For example, Dr. Lydia Kamenopoulou from Roehampton University worked with professionals and teachers in Greece. Academics from Greece worked in UK, in Romania, in Cyprus, Romania, in Greece. So we had the opportunity to exchange experiences in different educational settings and share experience from different educational and cultural environments. Training had the main characteristics of the training that trainers and trainees worked together, whereas when schools were in operation. So we worked as a team with presentations, with workshops, participant and non-participant observation. So teachers and professionals were active learners and contributors in the same time, because you had the opportunity to share experiences, to focus on students' real needs. There was also flexibility in time in order to adapt the training to the needs and the priorities of professionals. And of course, the time to have reflection. Synchronous and asynchronous online training events have been also taking place. Action research was the basic methodological umbrella of the main activities of the PrECIVIM project. Based on these stages: planning, action, observing, and reflection, with emphasis on building up communication skills of children with MDVI. And teachers and professionals who have participated in this phase, they filled in reflective logs based on action research. And of course, there was a mentoring on behalf of academics. This is the cycle of action research. So you can see the phases of the action research, the number of professionals who have participated, and the reflective logs that we have gathered. A few words for the other intellectual output. A guide of best practices has also been developed from the University of Thessaly. A policy recommendation and guidelines report, and also miscellaneous videos from University of Thessaly and from Babes-Bolyai University. The guide of best practices is based on the data of the reflective logs, based on the action research methodology, and with specific examples of case studies of children and how professionals worked with students, assessing and planning interventions and reflecting on these interventions. The guide of best practices will be available in 3 languages: English, Greek, and Romanian. A policy recommendation guidelines report is also very important because it includes issues regarding policies and practices that are required. And the aim is to increase awareness about the needs of children with MDVI, policies, practices for the development of curricula for training, for teachers training, and it will be available in English. And finally, the last one, the last intellectual output are the miscellaneous videos as educational resources. So keeping the time of my presentation and towards the end of the lifetime of the PrECIVIM project, yes, we are in the end, officially in the end of this project, but we have to talk in terms of sustainability. PrECIVIM project is in line with the social agenda of European Union on non-discrimination and equal opportunities of individuals with disabilities, including those with MDVI. But speaking on terms of sustainability, we have to say that PrECIVIM project is the impact of the PrECIVIM project is beyond the lifetime of the project. There was a positive impact on the professionals' competencies. They had the opportunity to work in multidisciplinary teams, share knowledge and experience, reflection, having mentoring. PrECIVIM projects also enhanced the development of collaborative networks and relationships between teachers and professionals. a range of dissemination activities increased and aimed to the sustainability of the project. And as I said before, all the tangible intellectual outputs will be available to professionals outside of the project and beyond the project as an open educational resource. And the next step, and beyond the project, there's still the need for teachers and professionals training regarding students with MDVI or deaf blindness in order to meet the needs and the requirements of daily practices. We need to promote partnerships and dissemination of good practices to work on multidisciplinary approach. During the lifetime of the project, we had the chance, as I said before, to work in different educational settings with different characteristics, with different social, cultural contexts. But then common elements have been revealed, common needs, common challenges, and common next steps. In order to promote equal opportunities to children with MDVI for their access and participation in different sectors of their life, at home, at school, or their social life. And I'd like at this point to thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Hara. Okay, great. Thank you very much for this presentation. I don't see any questions at the moment for you, Hara, but I'm sure, you know, if you stay on for more, something will pop up. So we're going to come back to you shortly. That was a very thorough presentation of the project. And thank you very much for giving us an overview of everything. We are going to now move on to our next speaker, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce her. She's Laura Pease, Principal of Whitefield Schools at the Whitefield Academy Trust in Northeast London. And like Hara said, one of the partners of the participating schools in the PrECIVIM project. Laura is here to talk about her experience in developing a unique curriculum for pupils with profound and complex needs at Whitefield schools. I feel that Laura doesn't need further introduction. She has done some incredible work and has, as a practitioner, but also as an author of research reports and book chapters relating to communication and complex needs. So, Laura, over to you.
Okay. So, as Leda said at the beginning, this conference involves participants from all career stages. And I guess I'm here representing the group that have been in the MSI field for a very long time, began in the deaf-blind field in England, and then developed my interests into MSI, MDVI. And I am going to slightly subvert what I was asked to talk about. I will talk about curriculum, but I'm going to take a slightly wider view and look at things that have stayed with me from my experience. So there's a poem that starts, "Everything worthwhile I learnt in kindergarten." And I feel that almost everything worthwhile I've learnt in teaching and learning came from the MSI world, where my SEN career started in a demountable hut in a playground in Walthamstow. And I've got a wider role now as principal of Whitefield Schools, still not very far from that playground, but I still feel that I belong to the MSI world, and therefore I'm really delighted to have been asked to be part of the Erasmus project and to contribute today. In a career in teaching and school leadership, you hear an awful lot of stuff from governments and speakers, and you say a lot of stuff, and some of it stays with you and some of it doesn't. Some things which are really important and significant during one period of time, you leave behind and you move on. And in this short thoughts, I want to mention and share the 3 things which from those early days I haven't left behind, which I think are still really important in provision for children with MSI, MDVI, and actually for all children with complex needs. The first thought is this, and no surprise to hear me say this: our children need a specialist curriculum of their own. It needs to relate to the national curriculum, but they need learning objectives and a shape to the curriculum that's written for them. And anyone who came into SEN after the 90s in Britain probably doesn't appreciate some of the nonsense and the agonies that we went through trying to link the curriculum for our most complex students to the national curriculum subjects. And gradually we took a more nuanced view, and we moved back to looking for a curriculum for our very complex learners, which starts where they are and teaches the subjects that they need to learn. So our aims are to prepare our children for adulthood and prepare them for the next steps, but also to give them the best quality of life and the most control over their lives that we can give them now. Working with children that may not live to adulthood concentrates your mind on the importance of what education does for them in the here and now. And for us, it's about giving them the best opportunities to reach out, to explore their worlds, and to build relationships. So Victoria School in Birmingham published a definitive curriculum for deafblind young people. And at Whitefield, we developed what we call the Reaching Out curriculum, because it helps children and young people with MDVI and other complex needs to reach out and be part of the world around them. It's an unashamedly developmental curriculum, and it is a sensory curriculum based around 5 subjects: communication, exploring the world, social and emotional development, physical development, creative development. It starts at the earliest level we can, and it builds on in the smallest steps we can, so that our children gradually reach out literally and emotionally, engage with their environment and develop their skills. They don't learn incidentally. They need that intensive support and those planned small steps for them. So I'd like to say that our curriculum is available from all good bookshops. In fact, it isn't, but it is available from the school. It looks like this. If you send an email to me or the generic address on the website, then you're very, very welcome to a copy to use and to help you with your children. Whatever specialist curriculum model we use, then we really need to hold on to it, as Ofsted rightly emphasises curriculum and sets off on deep dives. And we know already there are some special schools who've celebrated their specialist curriculum with great success in this new model. And we in the MDVI field in England certainly need to do that. Resist the temptation to step back 30 years and celebrate the curriculums that we've put together for our children. And my second thought, and again, not a surprise if you've read what I have written, it's all about communication. As Kara's presentation had a line, it's the fundamental domain, and it matters so much for our children. We are there in our field at the basics of what makes people human. And that for me is the ability to communicate with someone else. And I say to my staff, if at the end of their time with us at Whitefield, if they aren't better able to express themselves and to interact with other people, and if they aren't better able to respond to people around them, then whatever else we've taught them, we have let them down. Communication is the fundamental part of curriculum for these children. So we need to see every child as a communicator. And again, going back in my history, one of the first training sessions I went to was about the importance of sign language. Obviously, really, really important for vast numbers of children. And the message we were given was sign long enough at a child and they will sign back. Well, some of my children did, but most of them actually didn't. Signing and that formal communication was not the right thing for them. Fortunately, sometime in the 80s came two further developments. Across the pond, writers like Mechanism Treffry and Siegel-Cowsey put together a hierarchy of communication. And on this side of the Atlantic, in deaf-blind provision in a hospital, came intensive interaction, which showed anyone who doubted that every child and young person can communicate in a way that influences other people. And from this, the MDVI world put together an understanding of communication development where non-verbal communication was recognised and valued, with a hierarchy from reflex responses to behaviour designed to meet needs, and then to intentional communication through whatever works for that child. And after that, for some children, we can move to symbol or sign or speech, but we have moved away forever, I hope, from the perspective that children who don't use symbolic means are not communicators. Non-symbolic communication can be hugely articulate. I'm going to try and share screen to show you. So this young lady has no words and will never have words. And yet you can absolutely see communication about what fun swimming is, how much she likes the person working with her, and how much she wants to stay in that pool. Or attention on an object that brings pleasure. Or the sheer joy of communicating with another human being and really wanting them to stay and using every effort that you can to get them to stay with you. But a set of beliefs about behaviour that I probably first put together on an OHP many years ago. In terms of communication, every child has responses and basic needs. Everyone has behaviours which other people can learn to understand. Everyone can establish communication with at least one other human being. Nearly everyone can recognise when the people around them are trying to understand them. And every minute you spend learning to communicate with a child is time well spent. I'm really thrilled that the Erasmus project has focused on communication, not pre-language, whatever that might be, not pre-anything, but real communication, worthwhile and effective. And I know that it will equip many teachers in special schools to support their children to develop that ability to interact. And my last point is that our children need the right staff with the right training. The kind of curriculum that our children need puts huge demands on staff. Although we have written it down, it's not a cookbook. You need to be able to respond to each child in the moment and pick up those fleeting signs of interest or those idiosyncratic pieces of communication. You need to see children as learners. And again, looking back, the MSI world introduced intervener training to help adults come between the child and the outside world. And the MSI world fought for and got a mandatory specialist qualification to equip staff for the role. But as children with MSI go more diverse, and as provision gets more diverse, and as sensory impairment is allied with ever more complex needs, then we need another model of training to set aside those models and equip teachers and support staff to plan. As Jara said, it's about giving children equal educational opportunities by making sure that their staff are well prepared. I was really pleased to see that the Erasmus project had such an emphasis on sharing knowledge and research and on all the implications for CPD that has. I'm really proud that our school has been part of it, and I look forward to seeing further outcomes to make our children's lives better. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this, Laura, for this talk, which was very inspiring, and for sharing your beliefs and everything you've learned in your years of experience. I mean, I'm happy to open. I can't see any questions in the Q&A box, but I do have a question which kind of arose through the experience in the Erasmus project, and through all the scoping activities of the literature, policies, which I'm going to talk about later on, but also through a knowledge of the system. You spoke about training, the need for training, and I just wanted to hear your thoughts a little bit more about what you think would be, is, or looks like the future of training in this country for complex needs. Either you call it PMLD or MDVI or MSI. Where do you think we're heading? What are your thoughts? Because obviously you do have your own systems of training your staff, but in terms of an overall approach.
Yeah, so in this country there are advanced diplomas for people, for teachers going into special needs, and Mike from Birmingham University is coming on later and leads one of those. Those big training courses are really useful and really equip staff, and I hope that they continue, and I hope that we can look at perhaps developing one that's more for children with PMLD. In an ideal world, I would love that to be mandatory, but I don't think realistically it's going to. But I think also people in the field of complex needs don't have the same kind of incidental contact with other professionals in the same field as a mainstream teacher does, who meets many, many mainstream teachers. And so I think that some of the future is definitely about more projects like Erasmus that bring practicing teachers together and work together on some research and some shared understanding. Of course, sadly, we are Brexiting, and so that source of money through Erasmus will go. But I'd like to think that there will be money in the system to support professional exchange from people who are there doing the work and sharing what's worked for them.
Thank you very much. I'm going to move on to our next speaker, since we don't have any questions, but again, if anything pops up for you, Laura, I'm going to, we can come back to it if there is time. Right, our next speaker is our keynote speaker, and I'm very excited to introduce Peter Imray, who's a freelance trainer, advisor, and writer, well known for his exceptional work with children who have complex and profound needs. Peter has worked in education for nearly 30 years, mainly as a teacher and school leader at the Bridge School in Islington for learners with severe and profound learning disabilities. He has published books, articles, and book chapters on the topic of severe and profound learning disabilities. Peter's talk is entitled "Learn Different Means Teach Different: The Unacknowledged Challenges of Learning Difficulty," and I'm really looking forward to listening to what he has to say. Peter, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Lida. So I'm just going to try and call up my PowerPoint. Okay, you can see that. Lida, am I here with you?
Everything is perfect.
Okay, great. That's wonderful. Okay, so I've deliberately left my email address there, so that if anybody wants to contact me, please feel free. I'm very happy to have a conversation with anyone about any part of the PowerPoint. So I'm going to start off with some introductory thoughts and facts. I'll leave you to decide which are thoughts and which are facts. There's certainly a fact is around about 1 or 2% of the school population who have global learning difficulties. And by global learning difficulties, what I mean by that is to differentiate them between people who have specific learning difficulties, like, for example, dyscalculia or dyslexia. So global learning difficulties generally referred to PMLD, profound and multiple learning difficulties, severe learning difficulties, moderate learning difficulties in the UK, at least, or in England, at least. My argument for this presentation is that these group, this 1 or 2%, are being consistently miseducated in most schools, both in special schools and in mainstream schools. Around about 50% of children with SLD, for example, severe learning difficulties, are in mainstream schools, around about 50% in special schools. Actually, I'm not honestly sure that it makes a great deal of difference, as long as they are currently being taught within a differentiated curriculum model, which is based upon the national curriculum. In England, we have a national curriculum, but I don't think it really makes any difference which national curriculum we're referring to. I think the issue still applies in, for example, Scotland's curriculum for excellence, or Australian national curriculum, or I don't know, Greece has a national curriculum, but any of the European countries' national curriculum, mainly because these national curriculum are quite rightly, still specifically related to literacy and numeracy. Those two areas are at the very heart of any national curriculum model, and I think that they have to be. So I'm talking essentially about those with severe and profound and multiple learning difficulties, although that doesn't represent 2% of the school population. But my feeling is that in England, in the UK at least, there is another term, moderate learning difficulties, which is very weak and woolly. I'm not honestly sure that moderate learning difficulties actually exist. That is probably more of an extension of severe learning difficulties, because many with moderate learning difficulties will also struggle enormously with literacy and numeracy. I just want to say a quick word for the English audience, and maybe for overseas too, about the Pease scales. Some may know that the Rochford Review in England, I won't say they abolished the Pease scales, because of course they didn't, but they took the Pease scales away from the concept of being a comparative assessment schema, because the Pease scales were never designed to do that. All they are is fairly straightforward 8 levels of broad, neurotypical, conventionally developing children, the steps that children go through from birth to about 6. They are an incredibly useful, professional shorthand and commonly understood language. And it would be an enormous upset. It would be an enormous reduction if we were to abandon the Pease scales. The difficulty is that, of course, professionals have still got to talk about the learners that they're trying to work with. And I'll just give you a small example. I've worked with a number of schools around the country in trying to work with them on curriculum development. And because they don't use the Pease scales anymore since the 2016 Rochford Review, they've now come up with a number of alternative names. So I have, in just 3 schools, come across explorers, discoverers, pioneers, communicators, comprehenders, decoders, adventurers, experimenters, finders, and seekers. Now, I've got no idea what these words mean, and they have to be explained to me when I come in, and they have to be agreed amongst the staff. Much easier if we just get the Pease scales without necessarily taking them as seriously as they were being taken before. Now, I want to be clear in carrying on from this that I'm not talking about global developmental delay in this talk. There's no delay here. The learning difficulties, the very complex learning difficulties that affect these children and young people are as permanent as autism is, are as permanent as VI is, or as permanent as HI is. And this is not something that's going to go away. So the whole idea about delay is a misnomer. These children and young people are not delayed. So I know absolutely nothing at all about theory of relativity, but I do know a sensible person when I see what they say. And certainly Albert Einstein seems to be one of those. And he says that you can't solve problems by using the same thinking that caused the problem in the first place. So we might ask ourselves, well, what's the problem? The basic problem, I think this is an echo of what Laura was saying in the previous talk, was that the history of those with PMLD and those with SLD over the last 30 years, when they've been working within the national curriculum or being forced to work within the national curriculum, is one of consistent failure. We have enough records in England to know that this is the case, because at the very best for those with SLD and PMLD, the very, very best that they will reach is the start of the national curriculum. This is irrespective, interestingly, of educational context, whether these be special schools or mainstream schools. I think there's a lot of research around mainstream education. There's lots and lots of research around the improvements that can be made in mainstream education for reading and writing for those with severe learning difficulties, or usually for groups like Down syndrome kids, rather than severe learning difficulties themselves. Nonetheless, the research tends to point, vast majority of cases, points to incremental changes rather than fundamental changes. And I know of no methodology for somebody with a learning difficulty who doesn't do literacy and numeracy that will give them the fluency to improve their literacy and numeracy beyond eternal perseverance. So that seems to be the only philosophy that there is. If we keep on having a go, then eventually children will get it, is the ideology. But actually that ideology doesn't carry weight for those with SLD and PMLD, because by very defining nature of the learning difficulties, they are not going to get it. And I think that there is something really ironic in being able to read, write, spell a word like ice cream, and to know that ice, in fact, is a split digraph, without actually being able to have the ability to go and independently buy an ice cream. So this is not about the quality of special schools either. So the nature of the failure cannot be related to the quality of special schools in England, because 92% of them are good and outstanding. I think 38%, Laura's school being one of them, is outstanding. The facts of the matter are that it is what it is. It is what it is in relation to the nature of the learning difficulties. And I repeat, having the start of a curriculum model as the summit of the ambition is very, very poor ambition indeed. Now, this ought to be a national disgrace, the fact this has been going on for 30 years. And the fact that it's not a national disgrace is indeed a national disgrace. Now, this is a cliche, I know, but when a flower doesn't bloom or fails to bloom, don't blame the flower. It's not the flower's fault. It's because we put it in the wrong conditions, the wrong part of the garden, or whatever. We haven't catered for it. We haven't looked after it in the way that it needs to be looked after. And I think we have to recognize why pupils don't flourish before we can work out how they can flourish. Those with SLD and PMLD, and very many with moderate learning difficulties as well, have massive difficulties with a number of areas, but particularly communication being one of them, obviously. But one of the reasons why they might have difficulty with communication is also related to these, because they all work together against the child in terms of learning. And these are long-term memory, working memory, and understanding abstracts. Even the most able of those with SLD will not achieve functional numeracy and literacy because of these massive difficulties. I believe that we ought to be able to come to a professional conclusion and ascertain whether somebody is going to be fluent in literacy and numeracy. And by the way, fluency, I would indicate the start of fluency as occurring round about the end of Key Stage 2 in England. That's the age of 11. So this is just before children leave primary school and go into secondary school. This is round about the level of literacy and numeracy that children have to be able to have at some stage, or have to have the perspective of getting to at some stage before we can consider them to be have the potential to be functionally numerate and literate. And the reality of those who with severe learning difficulty and profound and multiple learning difficulties and moderate learning difficulties, that 1 or 2%, the reality of them achieving this, they are light years away from this. And again, by definition, are mostly working around year 1 rather than year 6 of a national curriculum model, perhaps year 2, but that's at a push. There is absolutely also no research evidence at all, despite a lot of research evidence that's attempted to show this, to suggest that such difficulties are open to remediation. And we come back to the nature of autism for life, VI for life, HI for life, and in much the same way, SLD is for life and PMLD is for life as well. Now, I also want to flag up some curriculum opportunities or work that's been done over the last 5 years with an organisation called Equals, which is known in England but may not be, it's known a little bit abroad but may not be as well known as it perhaps ought to be. It's a not-for-profit charity based in England. And they have, over the last 5 years, developed the first 4 of these curriculum models. Now, pre-formal curriculum, the PMLD curriculum, there have been a number of PMLD curriculums written, Whitefield's being one of them, certainly. Certainly the Equals PMLD curriculum is not a unique document, but nonetheless, it fits in, I think, with the other curriculum models, the others being, as you see on the chart, all of them perhaps working towards a national curriculum. But the point about the 4 curriculum models is that they're not related to the national curriculum. They're independent from the national curriculum. And I think this is really, really important that we develop an understanding that children, if they learn differently, we've got to be teaching them differently and indeed teaching them different things. Now, like it or not, whether we like it or not, all national curriculums, wherever they are, and whatever nation they happen to be, have to be geared for the norm. This is a quote from a guy named Jim Kaufman, who's an academic in University of Virginia. I'll read it to you. By definition, exceptional students require an extraordinary response from educators, something different from the ordinary, even if the ordinary is good. Failure to create these explicit structures to accommodate students at the extremes of performance distribution inevitably results in their neglect. They are forgotten. They don't just fail a little, they fail a lot, and their noses are rubbed in their failures. They don't just fail a little, they fail a lot, and their noses are rubbed in their failures. Now, why should it be that children, young people, and adults with severe learning difficulties and profound and multiple learning difficulties are attempting to learn by the same model as neurotypical conventionally developing children? I think this is down to inclusion, or at least educational inclusion. So absolutely inclusion is a good thing, but I'm really question whether educational inclusion does the things that it attempts to do. So I think the education inclusive lobby is incredibly influential, but it doesn't actually know what to do with these 1 or 2%. Certainly not the 1 or 2% who are at the other end of extreme performance distribution. Teachers are in their ITT, in their initial training, are urged to include and differentiate, but there's actually, beyond things like universal design for learning, which is effectively a differentiation model, or inclusive pedagogy, which again is effectively a differentiation model. there's nothing to suggest that there's a practical solution to this if these differentiation models are not possible. So we recognize that specialization does exist in the teaching profession because we have primary teachers and secondary teachers, we have history teachers and art teachers and science teachers, we have academics who specialize in particular areas, but apparently the one area of specialization that doesn't work out is for learning difficulties. So we have an understanding about specialization in the SEND terms, in terms of HI and VI, but not in learning difficulties. That seems to me to be just extraordinary. And I have no understanding of why this is. A number of things happen as a result of this exclusion from specialization. Pupils will fail because they're being taught by teachers and TAs who haven't been trained in the complexity of learning difficulty. And anyone who doesn't really believe that learning difficulty is complex, it clearly shows that they don't have an understanding of learning difficulty. But pupils fail because they're being taught a curriculum they cannot succeed in. Again, by definition, teachers and TAs fail because they're trying to teach children whose learning difficulties demand a specialist curricula and specialist teachers and TAs. And of course, society fails because it's wasting enormous amounts of money teaching pupils how to fail. I hold the UK in general and England in particular in enormously high regard because we do put an enormous amount of money into special educational needs and disabilities. Not as much as we should do, maybe, but that's undoubtedly true. But nonetheless, compared to many other countries, we spend an enormous amount of money, but we're wasting quite a lot of it because we're trying to teach kids things that they cannot, by their definition, learn. Okay, here's the crux of it. What can we do about it? Well, I think the first thing we can do is get rid of special schools. That doesn't mean to say we get rid of special schools, we just make them specialist schools. Now, this is I think I could have had a discussion about labels, and some of you may object to the labels that I've used. One of the labels I object to is special schools because it's reduced in significance and almost become an item of regret, or this child has had to go to a special school, and I don't think that's the case at all. It's quite the opposite. What we've got to do is to introduce the concept of specialization in learning difficulties, certainly at initial teacher training level, and we've got to take this really, really seriously. This is not a one day in a year or 2 days in a 3-year teacher training course. This has got to be a full-time specialism in learning difficulties and the nature of learning difficulties. We have to introduce the concept of specialist teaching assistants and take this seriously as well. Laura, I'm sure, will support me in this. There are an enormous number of incredibly skilled and adept teaching assistants that don't get the recognition and indeed the income that they deserve despite their qualifications. Those qualifications, however, would have been learned on the job rather than academically. But I'm not necessarily saying that that should change, but we have to recognize their specialist value that they have. We need to get rid of educational inclusion as a fundamental aspiration, because it only confuses. We have so many discussions about what inclusion means. We've actually forgotten to look at the purpose of inclusion, which is to improve and benefit all children. And I don't think educational inclusion in terms of everybody being in the same class and working under the same curriculum actually improves everybody. It does the opposite, in fact, for that 1% and 2% at least, and perhaps more. What I would do is go forward towards and have a look at a capability approach. So this is Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum. I've also written a little bit about it. This, I think, if we can succeed in adopting a capability approach in education, we might well lead to its adoption at society at large. Now, I'm going to define capability approach as really what happens when we think about equality, any particular quality. In this sense, let's say the educational potential of an individual with learning difficulties. Martha Nussbaum and Amartya Sen, amongst many others, argue that we should assess this in capabilities. That is people's real freedom to pursue and achieve, or not indeed to pursue and achieve, activities and states of being that they personally deeply value. And I'm sure I would echo Laura's point about communication here as being the fundamental area that children and young people with learning difficulties would want to improve upon. And it's very difficult to concentrate on communication when we spend our time trying to teach children how to read and write. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Peter. There is actually a question in the Q&A box for you, which I kind of think you have addressed. The question came before you reached that point in your presentation. Is this eternal question about inclusion, or if a special school is appropriate, particularly for children with very complex needs, behavioral issues, and non-verbal child, for example, was mentioned as an example. And so someone from the audience says, including such children in mainstream classroom is challenging, which I believe was the core of your presentation, and therefore a special school is more appropriate for such children. Would you like to add anything to this, or
Yeah, sure. Yes, sure. Yes, that's interesting. It's an interesting point, isn't it, about where it's challenging, because I suspect and I don't know that the writer of that question talked about it being challenging from the perspective of the teacher or the staff who are there, but actually I think it's also enormously challenging for the child themselves, because they're being people are trying to teach them things that are not necessarily relevant to them. And the way that education works, the way that fundamentally education in large institutions, and I'm talking about any school with classes of more than 5 or 6 or 7 children in a class, it is bound to work on a didactic model where fundamentally the teacher is in charge and the teacher imparts knowledge, and the children are there to learn and to soak up that knowledge and to understand that knowledge. Now, with somebody who has basic fundamental communication difficulties, problems with working memory, problems with long-term memory, difficulties in concentration, etc., they are spending so much of their time in a state of huge, massive frustration that they're not actually engaging with the process of their peers or what's happening in the classroom or the social interaction that might be going on. Because the fundamentals of the education system is not geared towards the things that they actually need. So it's not so much that it's challenging for the staff, and of course I appreciate that's bound to be the case. It's also immensely challenging for the children. And what we need to do is liberate children. We need to be giving children voice and agency, especially those at the extreme end who struggle so much in their lives. If the one thing that they can have is control over their life and how they lead it, and in fact what they do, then that's an enormous benefit. I think a massive, massive benefit. But mainstream education is not possible to do that within a mainstream structure. Just not possible. Too big.
Thank you very much. And I believe you've just answered the next question. You're always one step ahead. So there's someone who's actually asking if you think at some point there would not be any chance for inclusion, whatever we do, and if there would be a chance to change this impossibility. Isn't it the fault of governments and policies, implementations, and researchers? I think that's the gist of the question.
No, I don't think so. To be fair, I think it's in the nature of inclusion. I would regard inclusion as being the right to be educated. So again, I think the UK is very clear that all children have the right to be educated. What we need to make sure is they have the right to have the right education rather than the wrong education. So that's where we've gotten to problems, and we're regarding as though that every child has the right to be educated, and they must be all educated together. In the same, using the same model and in the same class, in the same school. And I think that that's silly, to be perfectly frank. And it's silly because it cannot meet the needs. There might be, I'm sure there are, some exceptionally talented teachers out there who are able to balance, 30 children in a mainstream primary school, and one child with autism, and one child with IHI, and one child with VI, and one child with challenging behaviour, and one child with severe communication needs. Maybe they can, and I'm sure they can juggle at the same time and recite the Bible backwards. But these are exceptional teachers, and it's not fair and not reasonable to expect all teachers in all schools to be able to cope with the level of extreme specialism that is the nature of these complex learning difficulties. And that's exactly the thing that we've ignored in this. So what inclusion has done is has almost shoved it under the carpet. Oh, well, anybody can do it if only you differentiate enough. But actually, that's not the case. I don't believe that to be the case.
Thank you. Thank you very much. The next question is actually very similar to a question I had, and I was hoping that you would talk a little bit more about the capability approach, which I have your book here. I may have read it 3 times already since it was published. So you speak a lot about the capability approach in this book in the context of PMLD and SLD. So the question I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that. In the audience, there's a question from the audience: which types of capabilities should we take into consideration in the capability approach?
Well, it's the whole point about the capabilities approach is that there are no prescribed capabilities. The capabilities are up to the individual. So the individual, what's really important is that the institutions are geared in such a way as to enable children to find the capabilities that they're really interested in, and to pursue those capabilities as much as they want to, but also not to pursue those capabilities. So, they have the option, and the whole point about this is that it's under the control of the learner. It's not under the control of the system. The way the education system currently works is that we have a defined end goal, which I suppose is GCSEs or qualifications of some description, which are the same for everybody. And people don't have the choice about whether they participate in this or not. They have to participate in that. The result is a kind of a nonsense that we get into, where if qualifications are the main thing, well, let's give everybody a GCSE, as in entry-level GCSEs. But actually, no employer that I would be aware of would be in the slightest bit interested in an entry-level GCSE. What they'd be interested in, how well can the person communicate? How well can the person socially interact? How well can the person socially engage? How well can the person think and problem solve in various issues? Nothing to do with getting an entry-level GCSE in maths or English. So we've kind of, we've got ourselves in a bit of a pickle. Because we put inclusion from a moral perspective, and I understand that from a moral perspective, with the Salamanca statements, but we haven't really thought it through properly, particularly for this small group. And as a result of that, I think what we've done is ignored this group, and we haven't given them a voice, we haven't given them agency. So it's not about there are particular capabilities that ought to be looked at, it's the capabilities that the individual child wants to present. And our job as teachers is to enable them to find out what they are, because they don't know what they don't know. And so it's about us presenting things to them in order to make sure that they've got a proper choice and freedom, rather than something that is imposed or restricted to them.
Thank you. I wonder if we have time for one more question that's just come in. It's about the role of the parents within this. many are very against sending their children to special schools, often to the detriment of the child. How do we change their views is the question.
Well, I think what you do is you open up, this is one of the problems about special schools, that it's become a derogatory term almost for a lot of parents, certainly a lot of academics, that it's regarded as being the pit out of which nobody is ever going to climb. And I think, there are very famous examples of people who have been sent along, a while ago to special schools and shouldn't have been there. And certainly there have been problems in the past about this, but I don't think we're really in that position now. I think it's much more open about what's being taught and the nature of the children there. I think it's a matter of education. It's a matter of explaining where children will benefit. And I go back to Laura's points that she was making about communication and about independence and taking what you learn in kindergarten, play being hugely important for very early developmental learners. These are not the things that are taught in school, but they are fantastically important, fundamental. The whole thing about intensive interaction. I don't know of a mainstream school that does intensive interaction, but it's the stuff of legend as far as specialist schools go. So it's about education. We can't, because special schools have such a bad press, generally speaking, mainly because of the inclusion lobby, I think. And because special schools have such a bad press, we're fighting a battle, but we can only do this by educating and by demonstrating to parents the nature of the specialisms that we can offer. And also, I'd say, the whole thing about curriculum is not just about mainstream curriculum. Most special schools, the vast majority of special schools, still teach a national curriculum model, still teach a differentiated national curriculum model. They haven't gone over to, because it's relatively new, the whole idea about different curriculum models is relatively new.
Thank you very much. Okay, I'm going to move on to the next presentation, and if there are more questions and there is time in the end, we can come back to them. So I'm the next presenter. A few words about me and my role in the PrECIVIM project. First of all, I'm really sorry if there is a lot of background noise. There is a construction right next to us, a building site, and they've just found the time to make the most noise possible. I'm really hoping you cannot pick up that background noise. So I was co-investigator, co-applicant for this Erasmus project, and I led the Roehampton team throughout. I'm a senior lecturer in special and inclusive education at the University of Roehampton, and my research focuses on inclusive education in the Global South, the inclusion of learners with sensory impairments, including those with complex needs, and teacher preparation for inclusive education in different contexts. So either mainstream schools, special schools, Global South context, Global North context. In this presentation, I'm going to talk in a little bit more detail following on from Dr. Kanari's presentation about the Roehampton-led parts of the project. So the research we undertook, the mapping phase in year 1, and the training we delivered in years 2 and 3. So I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully you can all see that. 1 second. Brilliant. That's not my presentation. That's my presentation. Okay. So we've talked a lot about training today and teacher preparation. One of the core aims of the PrECIVIM project, like Hara said, was the development and delivery of a blended learning course for professionals. And in my presentation today, I'll talk about this process. In particular, I'm going to talk about phase 1, the mapping phase in year 1, and phase 3, which is the delivery and evaluation of the training program in years 2 and 3. So for the mapping phase, it ran from September 17 until about July 18. And its aims were to map all policies, research and practices in the 4 participating countries, namely Greece, Romania, England, and Cyprus. This research, this mapping phase, was led by the University of Roehampton, but all partners contributed to data collection activities. Methods included systematic reviews of the policy and research literature, and gathering information on practices from the participating schools through case studies in the participating schools. We wanted to know what the situation is in the 4 countries and what specific training needs the teachers had in the participating schools before we started developing the training program. Here's a summary of the main findings of the mapping phase, which are included in the final report, which, like Hara said, will be made freely accessible for anyone to download and read in 3 languages, English, Romanian, and Greek. So the main findings, we found that policy and legislation specifically for individuals with MDVI and complex needs more generally could be made more extensive, for example, covering areas such as teacher training and preparation. The second one, we found very limited empirical research on this topic, and that more empirical research on MDVI and complex needs is urgently needed. We found that commonly practices used in participating schools were tailor-made, where they were bespoke, and there was little knowledge sharing with other schools or other professionals. So practices and programs developed by the partner schools, who are all special schools, could be systematized and disseminated more widely. And we found that more professionals training programs on working with children and young people with MDVI and complex needs need to be urgently developed. Regarding our focus on practices, I'm going to briefly talk about the case studies in the participating schools that we conducted during the mapping phase, for which we adopted a multiple case study design, with each school being the unit, the focus and the unit of analysis. There were 6 schools that took part in the project, 2 in England, 2 in Greece, 1 in Romania, and 1 in Cyprus. All of them special schools with a long history of educating children with vision impairment and complex needs. We gathered information on the profiles of pupils, teaching staff, and the organization of provision. And we also conducted semi-structured interviews with professionals focusing on the specific needs of children with MDVI in relation to communication, which was the focus of the project, the strategies being used in their schools in relation to communication, assessment, and development of communication. And we also asked them about their views about what works best, what are some of the best practices, and what challenges they face when working with children with MDVI. So here are some of our key findings, the key lessons we learned from the teachers' interviews in the 4 countries. So in relation to the specific needs of children with MDVI, teachers mentioned, they stress the fact that each child is unique. They mentioned the need for the child to find a way to express themselves and to communicate with others. the need for the child to make sense of their environment, as well as the need for social interaction. So professionals felt that these were key things, key areas that need to be developed in relation to children with MDVI in particular. In relation to strategies being used for the assessment and development of communication in children with MDVI, it was interesting to note that some strategies were common to all educational settings and others were only mentioned by individual settings. So this is the first thing we noticed. The important finding here is that teachers mentioned some prerequisites for strategies to be successful, such as, for example, the need for consistency, but also flexibility on the part of the teacher when necessary. This was described to us as the trial and error approach. Other factors that were seen key to the success of any strategy really were knowledge sharing amongst professionals, cooperation with both professionals and working closely with families. So these were considered key. In relation to professionals' views on best practices, again, they mentioned generic principles, such as establishing a relationship of trust with the child, and also specific strategies, for example, intensive interaction, the use of routines in order to make space and time more predictable and more accessible for children with MDVI, or the need for observing the child closely on a daily basis. So these were the best practice, some of the things we were told by teachers in relation to best practices. Finally, in relation to what teachers thought were the biggest challenges they face, they mentioned several important tensions, such as communication with families again, and collaboration with a range of external professionals, but also child-related issues, such as the challenge of understanding each child's unique communicative profile and unique style of communication. Lack of funding and resources and lack of permanent staff, I have to stress, were issues that were mentioned particularly by countries such as Greece and Cyprus. So we were told there's a lot of staff mobility. Teachers in those special schools might change from one year to the next. So those issues were really big challenges, were considered big challenges for them. Now, here's a summary. After the mapping phase, and according to our findings, the Romanian team led the development of a new training program, resources, and a training program for professionals working in the field of MDVI. So I have to correct this. So the Romanian team led the development of the training manual, and the development of the training program was led by the University of Thessaly. So it was a blended learning model, like Hara said. It included a combination of face-to-face and online training sessions, both synchronous, live sessions, a little bit like this presentation, a lot like this presentation, and asynchronous activities, which means they were completed by trainees in their own time. The formal evaluation of the training program was led by the University of Thessaly and required trainees to implement an evaluation with the child they worked with and to complete up to 3 reflective logs over the course of the intervention. The subgroup of professionals who were trained by Roehampton, who I will talk about them in a little bit, also completed an evaluation questionnaire before and after their participation in the training program. And here's a summary of Roehampton of the delivery and evaluation of the training led by the University of Roehampton. I believe it was a total of 50 trainees. I may be wrong in terms of the final numbers. This is what I remember from the portal that we were using. From 3 different educational settings, all special educational settings in Greece, were trained over the course of 10 months in year 2 and 3 of the project. We participating professionals, we had a range of roles of people participating in the training. There were, for example, senior school managers, trained special needs teachers, but also other specialisms such as occupational therapists, psychologists, phonoaudiologists. We did 5 face-to-face training days and a combination of synchronous and asynchronous online training sessions, 25 in total. And trainees were asked to complete a pre-course questionnaire and a post-course questionnaire, both comprising 10 questions each. Now, data analysis from these questionnaires is still ongoing, but I'd like to end my presentation with a couple of quotes from these questionnaires, which I believe are illustrative of what trainees thought were the biggest challenges they faced when completing the training. And here they are. I can read them for you. My student didn't have a stable participation in the intervention because of his medical profile, and I also had to face self-harming behavior. During these periods, his safeness was my priority. In other words, the person is saying that I couldn't always focus on the implementation of the intervention because of all these other things happening and how challenging the student was on certain occasions. The other quote is more about their current role and where they work. So they mentioned that their time schedule in the school is not flexible. So sometimes they have problems meeting the deadlines, keeping up with the deadlines set by the project in terms of, for example, submitting the reflective logs on time. And finally, I think that's very, very important. Trainees stressed that they valued the face-to-face part of the training more than the online, but not because of their contact with the trainer. I'm not taking it personally, but what they seemed to really appreciate and to enjoy is to be able to coexist in the same space physically with others who were dealing with very, very similar problems. They said common problems, and that need for meeting and exchanging knowledge, I think was echoed very, very strongly through the answers to these questionnaires. And that is the end of my presentation. Thank you for watching, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have either now or later on, if anyone would like to email me. Thank you. And going back to my webinar host role, I can see there are no questions. So we are for now ready to move on to the next presentation, which has been pre-recorded for us. So we have 2 very special presentations actually next up by 2 very well-known professors who have both done a considerable amount of work in the area of multiple disabilities and vision impairment. Both presentations have been pre-recorded, and I'll play the videos for you now. So first up is Professor Mike McLinden from the University of Birmingham, who will present. I asked him to present the new edition of his very well-known book, Learning Through Touch. So I'm going to play for you now Mike's speech that he very kindly pre-recorded, especially for this event. And because Mike is not here today, any questions that are about his talk will be addressed later via email. Okay. Hang on. Bear with me. There we go. I hope you can all hear that. Okay.
Hello, my name is Imray. In this session, we're going to be thinking about learning through touch, particular focus on supporting learners with multiple disabilities. So in terms of the focus of the session, we're exploring the significance of touch for learners with multiple disabilities.
Leader, I can't hear that. I don't know whether other people.
Really?
Yeah. I don't know whether other people can. But
Give me a second.
I can't hear it, or I can't see it either.
And then we're going to consider our own role as learning partners.
It's very, very faint.
Effective learning through touch for these learners. And we'll think about some key points at the
That's
end.
Is it better?
Yes.
Shall I go on? Can the rest hear?
Is there a vision? Is he?
Yes, I found the right button. Thank you for letting me. That should be better.
Okay, that's great.
We're going to be drawing on the second edition of the book called Learning Through Touch, which was written by myself, my colleague Steve McCall, and for the second edition, my colleague Liz Hodges. And if you have noticed, I've got an image of the book here. You'll see that the subtitle of the book is...
I need to go back. Sorry.
So you'd probably be familiar with the ecological systems theory that was proposed by Bronfenbrenner in the early 70s. And over the last 3 decades, he's revised it, and in 2005 proposed a revised version, which is the bioecological systems theory. And he did this as a way of emphasizing the active human right at the center. So I've captured that as an active learner right at the center of this complex system, which is rather like an ecology or an ecosystem in which human development takes place. So Bronfenbrenner was very keen to acknowledge the various influences on human development, influences which are very close to the individual at the center in the microsystem, as well as more distant influences, which Bronfenbrenner called distal influences. So what we've basically got is the notion of an active developing human, which we're calling an active learner for the purposes of this presentation and our book. And we have a range of close and distant influences on development. And that's quite helpful because it forces us to take seriously the notion of activity, of the active learner, but also acknowledge that there are some very complex influences on human development, and they will differ according to local, regional, national, and international contexts. The other part of Bronfenbrenner's theory was the introduction of time, and that was captured through the Kroner system. And that's a very useful way of reminding ourselves that things change, and humans develop, obviously, and systems change around the human. And you can think about the difference, for example, between a young child, between 0 and 3, for example, a teenager child, and then an older learner, someone potentially between 18 and 25, if we think about the SEND Code of Practice in the United Kingdom. And of course, all that's got different implications for how we think about learning through touch, depending on the age and the stage of the learner. So we have quite a sophisticated and complex model there, but we found that very helpful because it sort of provides us with a way of reminding ourselves of the importance of the active learner, which fits in well with the notion of active touch, which we've been promoting in the book, the influences on human development, and the fact that things change over time. And the way they change has been captured by Bronfenbrenner through this notion of progressive and mutual accommodation. And we like that as a phrase because it suggests the learner is changing and has to adapt and accommodate to changing environments, but also the environments are changing as well. And the notion of progressive mutual accommodation suggests that things don't stay the same. There is a constant change, and the way we structure the curriculum, the activities, the strategies will acknowledge that change. And the learner will be developing new skills, new strategies as a way of engaging with the world. The environment will also be changing and accommodating around the learner. So this notion of progressive mutual accommodation is a very important part of that. A final component of the theory, which we've been particularly attracted to, is this notion of agent. So the active learner being an agent of change. And that's a very important part of how we can think about multiple disabilities, because often these learners will seem to be very passive, very much recipients of information provided to them. What we need to be thinking about is how we can promote more active engagement in the world, and this notion of active learner, an agent of change, we think is a really powerful way of doing that. So in terms of the book itself, we've identified three main themes, which I think is quite useful just to run through briefly, because they're a way of sort of reminding ourselves what it is we're trying to do when we think about effective learning through touch. So useful, first of all, just to remind ourselves about the distinctive support needs of learners with multiple disabilities. And it goes without saying, because of the nature of what we're talking about today, there is reduced access to visual information, but also potentially other types of sensory information, including, for example, through touch. There may be reduced ways of engaging with the world to gather information through the different senses. So it's not just vision, but it may well be other senses as well that are impaired. Another thing we might want to be highlighting when we think about these learners is that full independence will not be a realistic objective for the majority of them by definition, and to a greater or less extent they're going to have reliance on a range of learning partners throughout their education pathway to mediate their learning experiences. So that's very important, because it suggests there's going to be a lot of people involved along that chrono system, along that timeline, and there is a lot of scope for inconsistent approaches. So it's how we develop and promote greater consistency throughout the education pathway and have common goals which we're all working towards. In terms of the support needs, we can think about curriculum access itself, and the focus for these learners will be on promoting a suitable balance throughout their pathway to ensure the learner can participate effectively within education, but also, crucially, has opportunities to develop educational outcomes needed to succeed later in life. So it's not just about providing access so they can engage with the world in the here and now, also about skilling them up, providing them with means that they can develop their own independence as far as possible, so they have opportunities to take control of their world. So it's that tricky balancing out between what we call access to learning, providing with access to the curriculum, but also developing and promoting learning to access skills so they can begin to take greater control of their world as they develop. And what we've stressed here is that learning partners are considered to have a central role in overseeing such development, facilitating what we are referring to as progressive curriculum access, with steadily increasing emphasis on promoting the learner's personal agent to shape their own learning environments. And that'd be very much in keeping with the model outlined by Bronfman, this notion of progressive curriculum access, emphasis on promoting the learner's personal agency to help them shape their learning environments. So our second theme is around implications of reduced vision for learning development. So what we've said in the text is that these learners will have greater reliance on quality information processed through other senses, including haptic perception. Such perception we can describe as relating to engagement with the world with a sense of touch, and haptic is sort of a way of describing what we might think of as active touch, activity in touch. The learning experiences of these learners will incorporate a range of sensory information, some of which will be distorting quality or quantity. And again, you'll be very familiar with that if you work or support learners with multiple disabilities. And in considering how a learner processes and acts upon sensory information, we can make a distinction between information received from within the body and information that is external. In terms of implications, we make a broad distinction in relation to the external information and divide that into distant senses. And often we think about distant senses being vision and hearing, but obviously we're also going to pick up a lot of information about the world at a distance through smell, for example. We can compare that to information that's close to the learner, and we talk about the close senses, so touch and taste are sort of common examples, but again, obviously smell as well can be a very useful close sense, as can vision and hearing. But the key thing is that in the absence of consistent information through the distant senses, so for example vision and hearing, the information received through close senses will increase in significance. And in the case of learners who are more reliant on information received through the close senses, learning experiences cannot provide precise information about the world unless they are mediated at a level appropriate to the learner's needs. So just being able to touch something, just having something presented in your hand, if you don't have useful vision, if you can't engage with that particular object in your hand independently, may not actually be the right sort of information to make sense of it unless there's someone doing the mediation helping you find out about what that particular object is that's being placed in your hand. So it's about mediation. So what we've said in the book in terms of our third theme is that in terms of mediating learning interactions, learning partners will need to have knowledge and understanding of their role in how best to mediate these interactions to ensure these are appropriate to the learner's individual needs. And conceptualizing the developing learner at the core of a bioecological systems model serves to emphasize the importance of ensuring that as far as possible, the learner is considered to be an active agent in development. So if you take nothing else away from this session, perhaps that's one thing to remember, this notion of active touch, but also the learner as an active agent in their own development. It's also important to stress that effective learning through touch is considered to be a dynamic process that is designed to promote and sustain a learner's personal agency, and therefore key focus of our intervention approaches will be on ensuring learners can use their haptic abilities in meaningful ways and with increasing independence in different contexts, so as to enable them to establish increasing control within their learning environments throughout an education pathway. And I'll return to that right at the end of the session, but that's the sort of key paragraph really. We're capturing the essence of what we are trying to do in our learning through touch text and what I'd like to emphasize in relation to this session. So what does this mean in practice? So that's the background, that gives us the context. But in practice, what we want to think about is how can we translate that into key strategies that we can draw on. So what I'm going to do now is talk through some key points, and I'm going to do it with reference to a real object. So I've got in my hand a nice textured ball, which I can squeeze, I can shake, I can feel, I can do various activities with. I've also got in my hand a small tin box, and I can place the ball inside the box. So what I'm going to do now is talk through some of the key points that emerge from those themes that I've just outlined, and we'll think about how we might be able to translate those into sort of workable strategies that hopefully you can think about drawing upon in your own role. So there will be many, but I've just drawn out a number of them, which I think would be quite useful for the purpose of this session. So this is quite a useful sentence to use if you're going to do any sort of professional development anyway, because it gives a lot of scope for participants to be thinking about how touch works for themselves and then think about the implications for learners they support. So learning through touch is more effective when ... And you can do that in relation to yourself. So you could say learning through touch for myself is more effective when. And for example, if someone said to me, how do you learn best through touch? I might say, well, when I've got independence, I've got control, when I can hold an object in one hand and feel it with the other, when I can do things with the object. And if I can't move my hand independently, if someone else is around to help me move it. If I can't move my hand independently, providing me with opportunities to find out about the object in ways that I'm not going to drop it. So if someone's presenting me the object in a small tin, for example, and I've only got good use of one hand, I can still be doing some actions on that object without dropping it or losing it. That's how I might respond to that, and you all have your own way of responding. But let's think about it in relation to learners with multiple disabilities who, as we know, have reduced information through one or more of their senses. We can't assume that their haptic sense, their sense of touch, is also completely intact. So we have to work within those parameters. But as far as possible, what we're trying to do, and this is very much in tune with the bioecological systems approach, is respect the learner as an active agent who has control of how she or he learns through touch. That's this notion of personal agency or control. And as far as possible, I'm holding the tin up again with the ball, providing control to the learner so that things aren't done to the learner, things are done with the learner. And it becomes much more sort of joint interaction to find out about the world through touch. So this notion of personal agency and control becomes a crucial part of how we can think about activity and the learner as an active agent. Learning through touch more effective when we respect the distinctive characteristics of touch. And part of what you will be doing is thinking about the differences between the senses. So if you think about how we interact with an object through vision, for example, as I'm holding a ball up, think about how long it takes you to know what the ball is, what it looks like, the various colours. Now, if you engage with that ball through touch, it's quite a different process, because what we're doing is something called linear processing. We're feeling bits of it, and then from those bits, we're trying to piece together a whole using those bits. That obviously is going to take more time. So we make this comparison between linear and holistic, and holistic is a processing approach which is very much aligned with vision. So the way we use vision, much more holistic, we see the whole, then within the whole we can look at the bits. Whereas when we think about touch, it's a linear process, it's building up bits and bits and bits of information and then trying to piece those together to try and make the whole. That's where the mediating might come in, because if we can't make the whole, we're left with lots of bits, and then that could be a very distressing, disturbing place to be in, because someone's presented bits of information, for example, an object's placed into my hand and taken away again. I've never had the chance to feel, to grab the whole. I've just had bits of linear information presented to me. So it's about providing the time, the opportunities, the environment to explore, but also acknowledging the distinctive characteristics of touch. And if touch is a linear sense, linear processing sense, then we need to respect that, provide opportunities for the child to engage with the object and ways in which the child can then start piecing together the bits to try and create a more holistic impression of it. The third point is about trust. And obviously, it's respecting the fact touch is a very intimate sense, and so we need to build up trust with the learner and respect the intimacy of that sense. So providing the learner with space to explore as an active learner. And again, if we take the ball, very tempting, and we still see in practice hands coming onto learners' hands, taking them over, place them onto objects. That doesn't feel very respectful. So how can we make that more respectful? And that's part of what you'll be thinking about as well. So touch is a very intimate sense. How do we build up trust, and how do we respect the learner's space so they can explore? And one simple solution to that for a learner who's able to reach out is to present the object inside a small container. So we've got a container here, and rattling the container and inviting the child to feel, to reach out, to locate, and then to place it back in there, rather than taking learner's hands and placing it on top of the object. It's about building up trust with the learner, encouraging them to develop and promote their own personal agency. And within that, of course, is this allowing the learner freedom of movement to explore. And again, a lot of practice that we've seen in the past has been very directive, and it's as an example, adults' hands on children's hands, taking hands, placing them onto things, and that sort of notion of hand over hand approaches. So you can imagine big hand coming onto my hand, taking my hand, placing it onto an object, and almost sort of directing how I'm going to be feeling that object. Alternatively, we can think about hand under hand approaches, where it could be, in this case, it could be a child's hands on top of the adult's hand, and together having a conversation about the object, much more respectful, and if the child wants it, they can pull their hand away at any point. So there's no forcing that child to engage with any interaction with the object. So allowing the learner freedom of movement to explore to whatever extent they're able to. And we're aware that many learners with multiple disabilities will have very restricted fine motor movements as well. So be thinking as well about the ways, even if they can move one finger, 2 fingers, or clasp an object, but with support, how that can be encouraged and promoted without necessarily taking hands and placing them onto things. And that all suggests that what we need to be doing all the time is observing carefully how the learner seeks to make sense of the world we touch. So watching carefully about the different types of what we can call exploratory strategies will be very important. And exploratory strategies will be more than just engaging with the world through touch. So for example, in this case, there's a nice jingly noise inside the ball. So how is the learner making sense of the various sensory information that he or she is getting? So rattling it, bringing it onto the face, perhaps other parts of the body as well, tapping it, hitting it, even throwing it to try and work out exactly what this object in my hand can do, and looking carefully at how the learner is engaging with it. So observing carefully will become sort of a very important point in terms of how we make sense of how the learner is making sense of their interactions with the world. Got 4 more points, and these again will sort of be captured in the book, and we've given some thought to them already, but this first one is really sort of reinforcing some of the things we've said already, which is about structuring the learning environment to promote exploration through active learning experiences. And again, it's the notion of activity, using trays, flat surfaces, the difference between trying to locate and find an object, for example, inside a small tin like this, compared to just placing it on the surface with no edges. And the surface with no edges is probably a recipe for losing the object, because the child, if they've got restricted fine motor skills, are going to be reaching out, possibly knocking the object could fall down, and that's it, could be gone. So thinking carefully about the microenvironment in which the learner is going to be engaging with learning through touch. Our next point, and again this is one that could often be forgotten about when we think about the learning experiences of these learners, is this notion of providing opportunities to learn through haptic observation. So what we mean by that is acknowledging the fact that many of these learners will have reduced opportunities to learn incidentally. They won't necessarily see how people use their hands or find out information about the world through touch. So we provide them with opportunities to feel how we feel objects, to do how we engage with objects. So imagine if I want to open a small tin lid, I can't actually demonstrate it in relation to this, but imagine I could actually set up a sort of hands, underhands approach where the learner's hands are my hands, and together we are feeling the tin, and together we're opening the tin, and together we are getting the sense of how you open and close a tin, how we feel the parameters, how we reach inside. So with a hand on top of my hand, this notion of hand under hand, we're providing opportunities for haptic observation. So the learner is able to also engage in those sorts of activities to find out about how I go about engaging with the world through touch. Alongside that, we can think about learning experiences that use authentic objects. So as far as possible, objects that still retain some authentic features. So shells and stones and feathers, for example, are great examples. And one thing I often say about is sort of guarding against removing those features. So removing, for example, the duckness of duck. So if you think about a small yellow plastic toy that we often use to represent duck, and visually they may look like a duck, visually it may even act like a duck when it's in the bath water, for example. But actually through touch, the duckness of duck, what makes a duck, has been removed. There is very little there that still feels like a duck. So thinking about how we create more authentic learning experiences so that they then respect the way in which touch works. And finally, in terms of those learning points, is about the opportunities to learn through having fun. And, you know, we could put that at the beginning and the end and in the middle, and obviously that's going to be absolutely crucial. You know, why will a learner want to be engaging in learning through touch unless it's a nice experience, a pleasant experience, a fun experience for them? So the sorts of things we might do, and again, I'll return to my tin box with the ball. Imagine a child who's a bit reluctant to put their hands into things, but they do like warm soapy water. So imagine placing some warm soapy water inside the tin and placing the object inside, and then making it a fun experience with the child's hands on your hands, and together we're feeling into the water, and together we're trying to find this treasure inside the box, and then together we can find it and then start exploring it and popping it back in again. So think about how you make the ordinary extraordinary for the child as a way of enticing them to want to learn through touch. So they're just some key points that you might want to be thinking about. They sort of come out of the book. They also hopefully provide you with some strategies that you can be thinking about how you can adapt them. I've tried to summarize it into one short paragraph, so we're sort of capturing the essence of what we've just been talking about in the session. And I'll read this first, and then we'll just unpick it slightly. So in summary, learning through touch is more effective when, and again, you could have had that conversation with colleagues, with participants, if you're running any sort of professional development session. And then you can start generating some, not just some key points, but some sort of summative paragraphs at the end to capture the essence of it. And in this case, when intervention approaches are structured to ensure learners can use their haptic abilities in meaningful ways and with increasing independence in different contexts. And this is the crucial bit, so as to enable them to establish increasing control throughout their education pathway. And if you think about the model we presented at the beginning, the notion of the active learner, the notion of that, the timeline, the Chronos system, that which we can equate to the education pathway, how do we ensure that we're not just giving the learner opportunity to access the world, but also developing their independent skills so they can establish increasing control throughout this pathway. So effectively, that's the session finished. And what I'd like to do, this is the last slide, just think about next steps in relation to your own role if you are supporting or working.
Okay, we are running out of time, so I'm going to move on to the next presentation, if anyone can hear me. Because we have Professor Marisol Moreno Angarita here from the other side of the Atlantic, I'm going to, if that's okay with you, Marisol, because I can see we're a bit running behind. I'd like you to go ahead with your presentation, and I'm going to show Professor Oakleyford's presentation after you've finished, if that's okay with you.
Thank you, Lida. Can you hear me?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Thank you very much for this invitation. I really enjoyed all the presentations because in some ways we are so far away in this topic in the Global South. So my story is not so a happy one because most of the developments, reflections, and issues that you have already talked about, we are just, far away because multiple disabilities and complex needs is still very invisible in our historic development of inclusive education. The last of the last are people with multiple disabilities and visual impairment. So I want to share with you a view from Colombia and South America, and some reflection also from the Global South. What do we understand today by inclusive education? We are talking about Colombia, we are very development. We are already very aligned with the CDRPD. and UDL is one of the framework recommended for early childhood education until higher education. By the law, all the students has to get an IP and use multiple means of presentation of information, multiple ways of action and expression, and multiple ways of motivation. So in the middle of these milestones of inclusive education, we have a law from 2005 related to blind, related to blind and deaf people. And in 2009, we ratified the convention. And in the last 3 years, we become with a new decree about inclusive education, because even when we have since 1994 inclusive education, society has not recognition at all. I mean, there is a lot of barriers, teachers disagree with inclusive education, they are still missing a lot, special education. We don't have a special education in Colombia since 1994, exactly at the same time that the Declaration of Salamanca. So means that from the educational system, there is a lot of pressure and pushing around inclusive education, but teachers and the educational system is still far away of this aspiration. The context of my country is that we are almost 50 million people, and people with disabilities is 7.1% of the population. We follow the ICF conceptualization of disability, understanding as the result of the interaction between the person and the context. We have very, very last development related to certification of disability. Colombia is one of the last countries in the region to have this kind of post of ID related to people with disabilities. So it makes very complex the access to all the policies because of this situation. And in Bogota, we have about 10 million inhabitants, and most of the people with disabilities are people related to multiple disabilities, visual impairment, deaf, and also some rare illness. Because of the law about deaf and blind people, we have a chair at the National Council of Disability for a person with blindness and deafness, but not include other population with multiple disabilities. One of the reflections related for about needs for people with disabilities and their families, we have a big tension related to institutionalization. Still, families are claiming services for their children and youth related to institutionalization, even when we know that it's against the law, against the CDPR. The inclusion of the family in the educational process is still very complex, because due to a very, very low results in rehabilitation process, children with multiple disabilities come into the educational sector with a lot of difficulties, barriers, and the rehab process even very, very low development. So it makes very complex to come into the educational process. UDL is one of the ways that has been putting it in the middle, the needs of the people with disabilities, and especially multiple disabilities, trying to give a lot of option to access to learning and to curriculum. Another need that is very, very common when we talk with people and with families and with teachers is how families are so unhappy because their voice and values are not recognized at the school environment. The communication channels are insufficient. We are still a lack of knowledge about multiple disability needs and complex needs, because in Colombia, there is big development for deaf people and big development for blind people. but not for both of them. I mean, for multiple disabilities and complex needs, there is still very, very few efforts. The education and knowledge of the teacher related to this population invisibilize the knowledge of families, because in some ways, many of the families are still missing special education. So they always regret that Colombia doesn't have a special education, and they are not so happy with inclusive education, especially for this population. I make to do that clarification. Curriculum accessibility still has big barriers, but for this few population of people with multiple disabilities, because as I told you, we have one of the best education for deaf people in the region. Colombia has a bicultural and bilingual model for deaf people. Since for the last 3 decades, we have been working on that, and now deaf people can have access to universities, and also blind people has access to university, but not people with multiple disabilities. There are also missing of initiatives that value diversity and improve learning outcomes for people with complex needs, because the educational system doesn't have clear what can be the services for them. By the moment they go to a regular schools, and teachers feel not so happy about, because they don't know what to offer and how to interact. So there are a very, very private, there are a lot of private providers that can support children with complex needs, but they don't have any support from the state, because we don't have special education support by the states. So for coming into the last part of my conversation, the biggest challenge that people with multiple disabilities are facing in Colombia and in the region in this moment is that the government and the system demands a lot of support of families, demand that family has to pay services for their kids, for their students. The second one is that a community doesn't understand yet that education is the result of the collective action. So families are very, very isolated, and they have to do everything but themselves. Financing and resources for diverse education are growing, but are still very few for people with complex needs, because there is no a clear policy related to people or students with complex needs. We have a very strong inclusive education policies, but inside these policies, there is no clarification about this population. Training training parents and teachers and all the personnel related to educational system is still a big challenge. There is a lot of ignorance and lack of information related to complex needs and how they can be active learners and how they can be part of the classroom, and how can all the school be very beneficial from them. The other challenge, very, very big challenge, is elimination of stigma and discrimination. It's a lot of barriers, attitudinal barriers, beside physical, beside didactic barriers that has to face in this situation, because teachers and families still think that barriers are in the students. They don't understand that students face barriers where they come to access to curriculum or to the classroom environment. And finally, and it's a big, big issue, we don't have really clearly who are and where they are and what are their real needs, because the national census only asks about blind and deaf and sensory, but not this issue about complex needs. So I want to finish my short presentation with a video, because I think that as we are so far away, the only way that I see in this moment is to hear the voices of people with complex needs, with people with multiple disabilities. So I want to share this video that is from a girl from Argentina, and she represents a lot of the situation of the global South. She belongs to a movement of young people who are trying to claim their rights and to be here. And they are working in a collaborative process with UNICEF, Latin American and Caribbean region. So Lida, do you want to help me to show the video?
Sure, I will do it from here.
Okay, thank you.
Send it to me, okay? So let me find it. Can you all see that?
Yes.
That's brilliant.
Soy Irene Cuevas, tengo 17 años, vivo en Altagracia, provincia de Córdoba, Argentina. Voy a cuarto año del secundario, con especialización en ciencias sociales de una escuela pública. Durante la pandemia participo de las tareas que envían los profesores, pero con mucha dificultad porque no tengo apoyos. En mi cole no implementaron las clases por videollamadas, solo envían tareas y tengo que descargarlas. Las explicaciones de los profes son necesarias para mí y no las tengo. Para poder participar de la educación a distancia, el sistema educativo debe contar con profes preparados y dispuestos a ofrecer los recursos y la asistencia personalizada que cada alumno requiere. Y todos deben tener accesibilidad y las herramientas tecnológicas. Ni siquiera han sido tenidas en cuenta las necesidades de los alumnos compañeros sin discapacidad, mucho menos las mías. Aunque yo cuento con la tecnología, no tuve asistentes de manera presencial, ya que no se consigue profesionales formados y con compromiso, ni son cubiertos por mi obra social ni el Estado, a pesar que me protege una resolución judicial de un tribunal de mi provincia, y además una medida cautelar de la Comisión Interamericana de Derechos Humanos de la OEA, que tampoco cumplen. En mi caso particular me cuesta mucho cumplir con las tareas, al no tener apoyos que me asistan motrizmente, ni que realicen las adaptaciones de acceso en lo visual y auditivo. Todo quedó a cargo de mi mamá dentro de sus posibilidades, generando una situación difícil para todos. Mis tareas se atrasan, lo que me produce angustia y preocupación. He estado nerviosa, sin poder dormir bien y tensa, extraño a mis amigues, a mi prece, y no poder salir. Pasaría mejor este encierro si tuvieran la autonomía que logro con los asistentes que necesito. Escribí esta poesía titulada En prisión en 2020 mayo durante el aislamiento por la pandemia de coronavirus. Ser tan sensible asusta. Dame tiempo para acostumbrarme. Es distinto en cada momento que vivo este encierro. Dame arte para acostumbrarme. Es tan sofocante esta urgencia. Dame energía para acostumbrarme. Es cada vez más insoportable tener que acostumbrarme.
Thank you, Lida. So that's my conversation about. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Marisol. And we do have a question, I believe. First, you're being congratulated on advocating for this group. They said the video was heartbreaking to watch, and much admiration to you and your colleagues. Keep fighting. That wasn't a question, it was a positive comment. So someone cheering you on from the audience. And thank you so much for giving us the perspective from the Global South. And I wonder, because you mentioned that the girl from Argentina represents a lot of what happens in Colombia. So I was wondering, because I'm aware many people from our audience come from other parts in the global south, such as, for example, Bhutan, or countries in Asia. I wonder how, where the situation is, and if it's common in the global south. Yeah, very, very interesting presentation. Thank you. And I have to also say, because I panicked because we were running out of time, I forgot to introduce you properly and to say that when it comes to inclusive and special education in Colombia, Professor Marisol Moreno is the #1 expert. She has advised policies, governmental policies. She has conducted many years of research, especially in the early years. And I know you've done a lot of work in the area of universal design for learning. So we really value the fact that you honored us today, took the time, and you came to give us a Latin American perspective, which I believe has enriched this event so much, and has given us a lot of food for thought. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks to you, Leda, and all of you. Thank you.
Thank you. Right, so I am going to, we are nearly at the end of the event. First, I'm going to close the event, and I'm going to leave you with our last presentation, which Professor Oakelford has very kindly pre-recorded for us. And it's I think an uplifting presentation. It's all about the value of music as a natural language for children with visual impairment and complex needs. Before I leave you with Adam's closing presentation, I'd like to warmly thank all our presenters again for honoring us with their presentation, their time, their contributions, for sharing their wisdom, and for making this event a success. Any questions that have not been answered will be addressed via email. And also finally, just to say that the recording of this event, pending permissions, of course, from everyone who took part, will be made available for everyone to access from anywhere in the following days. So I'll let you know when, we will let you know when this is done. Many thanks to all of you for attending this event, and I hope to see you again in future events like this one. So I'm going to now share my screen and show you Adam's video. Just to say a few words, I keep forgetting to introduce the presenters. I don't think Professor Oakelford needs an introduction. He is Professor of Music at the University of Roehampton, and he has worked with young people who are blind or partially sighted for over for the last 35 years at Linden Lodge School in Wandsworth and the RNIB. He's researched and written widely on how visual impairment affects children's developing musicality. He created his zygonic model theory of musical structural understanding, and it was used subsequently to form the Sounds of Intent framework. He's the founder and trustee of the Amber Trust, a UK-wide charity that supports blind and partially sighted children and young people in the pursuit of music. And he's going to talk about this work in his video. So here we go.
Hello, and welcome to this talk about music for children and young people with profound learning disabilities. I want to make the case that music is a natural language that all human beings share. We know that music develops in the brain before language, and indeed, as a species, we know that music developed in us as humankind before language. Music was around, we think, about 500,000 years ago, whereas language came around about 250,000 years. So music's been around a long time. And what can it do? It can communicate lots of things that words can. In some ways, more effectively actually. It can communicate how we're feeling. We can get to know how other people are feeling from the sound and the music they make. And we know that by sharing music and sound, we get to feel as a group, we get to bond with other people. And so music really is a profound way of being around people and forming friends. I'd like to show you a video that was made by the Amber Trust, which is a charity I set up about 25 years ago to support visually impaired children, including those with learning disabilities. In the video, you'll see mention of sounds of intent, which is a framework of how music develops in all of us. There are sort of 6 phases of musical development. The first is before hearing really gets going. The second I call sounds important. It's about how we perceive sound and music. Level 3 is about pattern. So it's about predictability. It's about really perceiving, starting to make sense of the world and starting to make sense of music and sound. Level 4 is about what you might call ringtones. When we hear music, we actually hear groups of notes together, like mobile phone ringtones. And that's a stage in the psychological development of musical understanding. Level 5 is called whole songs in time and in tune, which children typically get to from the ages of 4 or 5. And level 6 is really about understanding music in the context of the culture in which you're growing up. And typically young teenagers get to that level. Now, children with profound disabilities tend to be functioning at levels 2, 3, and 4 of the sounds of intent framework. Level 2 is about perception. It's about making sense of sound for the first time. Level 3 is about pattern and predictability. And level 4 is about those chunks of sound, the mobile phone ringtones. So here is the video made by the Amber Trust. I do hope you enjoy it and find it informative. And hopefully it will contribute to today's conference. Thanks very much indeed.
So I'm going to play the video, which I have saved here.
We don't worry about a thing. In this film, we're going to see 5 children who all have visual impairment and quite complex needs. But music is the common theme for all of them. Children with complex needs, for them the world is a sort of buzzing, booming, confusing place. And sound is a really key part of that, especially for children who can't see or can't see very well. Round and round. Oh. To me, music is like a strand that goes right through a child's life and the way they learn. And the key thing is to tap into that at the right level so that children can make the maximum progress and above all, have fun. That's it. 20 years ago in the year 2000, we realised that actually that nobody knows how children with complex needs develop musically, how they can make progress and the kind of things we can expect of them. So we sat down with a group of teachers and therapists and parents, and we started thinking, what can we observe in these children, the way they engage with sound and music? What kind of development is there? And what can we do to help it?
Feel how long the string is.
Sounds of Intent is a framework of sort of 6 milestones on the road to musical development that's rooted in the needs and abilities of children with special needs. And it's very much a framework of growth. So it starts from sort of self, the innermost circle on the framework, and expands outward into the world. So it's a nice metaphor for the way that children develop and grow. Level 2 is about the sensory stage. It's about the beginnings of perception, really. So Aaron is very much at the sensory stage of perception. So lots of information is coming into his brain through his ears and his eyes and his hands, and his brain's trying to figure out what it all means. So the important thing is to give him rich, meaningful experiences.
Aha, strumming.
As he plucks the strings, as his fingers feel the buzz of the sound under them, at the same time his ears are picking up the sound and his brain is starting to make the connection between cause and effect.
Ba, ba, ba. Nice knocking game. Aaron.
A key thing is really connecting sound with other inputs. So a crucial thing for level 2 is to connect sounds that are going into the ears with other multisensory experiences, like feeling the buzz of strings under your fingers, for example, of seeing an instrument sort of bouncing off the light in front of you. So Alice is very much at the sensory stage of development, so she's still taking in lots of information about the world and trying to piece it together almost like a jigsaw to make sense of what she's hearing and what she's seeing. The great thing about the sound beam is that it means that any movement that Alice makes can be linked to any sound, and that's really empowering for her, because very often children like Alice would find it hard to play conventional instruments. But with a sound beam, even the slightest movement of a hand or an arm or a head can make a whole symphony of sound. And that really gives her a good chance of understanding cause and effect. Alice can get that what I do will create a change in my environment. Level 3 is really where music gets going. It's about pattern, it's about predictability, it's about copying. And the best way to start really with level 3 is to copy what the child does.
Don't worry, be happy, yeah. Don't worry.
For Drew, she's really stimulated by the musical accompaniment. That gets her brain, you can see it gets her brain fizzing with fun. And then within that basic framework, we play copy games, essentially. So I copy what Drew does, and Drew copies what I do. And straight away you can have a dialogue within a musical framework.
Ready?
Music's so easy to copy. All you have to do is tap a drum or shake a shaker. And if someone else copies you, then straight away you've got a relationship, because the child can think, oh, I see, so I can affect what that person does. And maybe they're doing the same as me, maybe they are a bit like me, maybe they think like me, and maybe they feel like me. And so the whole empathy that's so important to us as human beings can start to evolve through these simple musical turn-taking exercises. Level 4 is about chunks of sound, the building blocks of music. When we listen to music, we don't hear individual notes. We hear patterns, what psychologists call gestalt. So it's like shape. And it's a crucial stage of musical understanding. Looking at Felix, you can see how he's very much a level 4 child. He plays bursts of rhythm on the drum. So for him, music is about these individual chunks of 3 or 4 notes that follow one another. And he loves using those chunks of sound in an interaction, and also in the context of a wider piece as well. So he can make music with another person by using these building blocks and putting them one after another. Felix is visually impaired and hearing impaired. So for him, vibration is particularly important. And he can feel vibration through my fingers, for example. He also enjoys touching instruments as they're being hit, like the drum, because he can feel that vibration. Ah. And the combination of the sound going through his ears and the sound, the vibration coming through his body gives him an experience that he relishes. All right. Hi, Jack. Should we go? Jack is really on the cusp of level 4 and level 5. So he enjoys chunks of sound. He'll play little bursts of melody on the keyboard. Jack, play it, ready? Incy, wincy, spider, climb up the water spout. Down came the rain and washed poor Incy out. Out. And he's just learning how to stitch those together to make whole pieces. Incy, wincy, spider, climbed up the spout again. He's got a good sense of rhythm and a good sense of pitch. And he's learning to move his fingers in the right way in order to recreate on the keyboard the patterns of music he's got in his head. Ready for Twinkle Twinkle? Twinkle. Little star, how I wonder what you are. As a teacher working with Jack, the thing is to scaffold his development. So he's really functioning about level 4 with chunks of sound. And just with a little support, he can be encouraged to link those chunks together to form a whole song, Twinkle Twinkle, for example. So he'll play the first little bit, and then he'll need a bit of a hand to get to the beginning of the next chunk of sound. Diamond in the sky. Twinkle, twinkle. It's about giving a child just the right level of support for them to succeed. And the aim is to fade that support so that the child is increasingly independent. You can see through a lesson how Jack goes from needing quite a high level of support to being really quite independent in playing a tune. Ready? Incy, wincy, spider, climbed up the water spout. Down came the rain and washed poor Incy out. Out came the sunshine and dried up all the rain. Incy. Sometimes it can be overwhelming when you see a child with quite complex needs. It can be a real challenge to know where to start in terms of music making. But the golden rules are: observe, don't be afraid to take time, that's crucial, to see just how a child reacts to music. And try and use the way they react. They may move, they may be still, they may show an emotion, to try and figure out what's happening in their brains. A knee, knee, clap. A knee, knee, clap. A knee. What this film tells us is that disability is no barrier to music making. And also there's a distinct path of development that children will follow, and it's crucial that practitioners understand how music develops so they can promote a child's musical journey in the best possible way. Upon your knee. Yay! Jack, that's amazing.
Brilliant. We've gone over by 8 minutes, but I'm just going to thank again our panelists and everyone who attended this event. Thank you, Peter, and thank you, Hara. I know Marisol is there, but she has her video, so thank you, Marisol. Thank you to Laura, who had to leave earlier. And thank you to our virtual presenters, even more virtual than us. Thank you for your contributions and for making this event a real success. Thank you.
Wish you all the best.
You too, everyone. And best wishes for 2021 and beyond.
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye. Goodbye.